Welcome to the Evergreen Thumb episode 62. Today is all about native plant groupings and pairings. I'm going to talk about the concept of plant guilds, how to design mutually beneficial plant communities using Washington's native species across a variety of climates within Washington. We have an incredible diversity of climates and plants in the state of Washington. Like USDA zones, they vary from about 5A to 9B, which is a huge range, from rainforests, particularly like on the Olympic Peninsula, to a shrub steppe in the Columbia Basin of central and eastern Washington. And so I'm going to try to give you some suggestions on different guilds for different climates. I also want to mention that this idea for this episode came from a listener. And so if you have a suggestion for an episode topic, I'd love to hear from you. Email me at hello@theevergreenthumb.org. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, what are plant guilds? Plant guilds are groups of plants that work together, each providing different functions. The concept of plant guilds comes from my training in permaculture design. Each plant in a grouping has a specific function that works either in conjunction with or has more than one use within that grouping. Some of the benefits of combining these plants can be soil building, pest control, pollinator support, erosion control, and reduced maintenance. In permaculture, typically plant guilds also include some food benefit. That's not necessarily the case with these native plant guilds. And maybe you're asking, why native plants? Native plants are already adapted to our local conditions. So depending on where you live, there is a huge variety of plants that thrive in your specific area and in your specific conditions. And those plants support local ecosystems, local wildlife, local pollinators, and the wildlife and the insects and pollinators are naturally adapted to those plants. Another advantage of native plants is that because they're so well adapted, once they're established in your garden, they have very low water needs and very low maintenance requirements. As a whole, creating guilds of native plants create resilient landscapes. Again, because they have lower water needs, lower maintenance needs, and they are supporting our native ecosystems. The general concept of a guild, or I'll call them guilds, but think of them as groupings that if you go out in a natural area, you will see a lot of these plants are naturally grouped together because they all fit a niche within that ecosystem. The primary functions of plants within a guild or a grouping start with the canopy layer. These are large trees that provide shade, structure, and wildlife habitat. Now, if you live in a urban or suburban community, you may not have room for these canopy layer trees because generally these are very large overstory trees, and that's okay. You can leave these out. And if you have a really small yard, you may need to leave out the subcanopy or understory trees as well. You need to adapt these to what works for your space. Subcanopy or understory trees are smaller trees that thrive under a partial canopy. So they like dappled shade or partial sun. And sometimes if they're an edge tree, typically are on the edge of a habitat, then they can sometimes tolerate full sun as well. A shrub layer, it is a mid-height woody plant. Shrubs can actually vary in size from 1 or 2 feet tall to 20 feet tall. So a lot of times they have berries on them, which are good for wildlife, and they are also good for habitat. The fourth layer is herbaceous perennials, and these are non-woody flowering plants. They offer seasonal interest, whether it be flowers or color, as they die back, seeds, and things like that. The fifth layer is the ground cover layer, and these are low-growing plants that protect the soil. They suppress weeds. They can be food as well. There are a lot of fruit-bearing ground covers. but they work like a living mulch in your garden. And then there are two other layers that are optional in this situation. Typically in a permaculture guild, these would be great food options, but may not fit in an ornamental or in a native plant garden, depending on the region. And those are a root layer. These are plants with roots, bulbs, or corms that provide a function and a benefit in the soil. And also a vining layer. These are climbers that can use vertical space, typically flowers, sometimes fruit bearing. We do have a number of native vining plants. Some other considerations as adjunct to those layers are including nitrogen fixing plants, which improve your soil fertility. These can be trees, shrubs, or herbaceous plants. They can fit into any of those categories. And then there's pollinator attractors. So plants that support beneficial insects, typically with flowering. Some design considerations to take into account are matching these plants to your specific microclimate. Even if you live in an area that fits the description that I give for this guild, keep in mind that there are microclimates and, your high temperatures or low temperatures may be slightly different from your surrounding area, which could inhibit the viability of some of these plants. And then consider the mature sizing and spacing of these plants. Because they are specifically adapted to these regions, they could possibly get bigger than you would expect. Especially, like I said, the canopy layer trees, these are very large overstory trees and are going to be way too big to fit in a typical urban or suburban garden space. Another thing to think about is seasonal interest and succession. So thing like a nine bark or a dogwood that the leaves tend to turn great colors in the fall, or the bark has color to it like a red twig dogwood that adds winter interest. Mix some evergreens with some deciduous shrubs so that way you don't have just a bunch of sticks all winter long. Think about the flowers and and the succession of how those plants bloom throughout the season so that you can have a succession of blossoms and a succession of benefits to benefit wildlife and pollinators. And also think about the vertical and horizontal layers. Make sure you get a nice assortment in each layer. Your canopy layer is going to, depending on the size, like I said, maybe you won't have any, maybe you only have one, maybe you have three. If you have 3 Western Red Cedars, you probably have a pretty good sized front yard. My house I grew up in, we actually had 3 cedar trees in this nice big front yard, and we had salal growing underneath them. It was about the only thing that would grow underneath them. And it was a nice shady area in the summer. Also plan for maintenance access. Make sure that you can get in to, the center of this garden, whatever it looks like for you, so that you can make sure that you're able to weed and pull out plants that you don't want there. Okay, next I want to talk a little bit about some climate zones. Like I mentioned, we have a wide range of the USDA growing zones from 5A to 9B. But more specifically, Western Washington is primarily a maritime climate with very wet winters and dry summers. And then we have some areas are wetter than others, especially if you're in the rainforests or near the rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula or along the coast. You're going to have cooler summers than someone who's further inland. And then we also have the mountain zone. So these are the Cascade foothills and up into the mountains. These are higher elevation. They have a shorter growing season, and they tend to have heavy snow in the winter. For Eastern Washington, we have the lowlands of Eastern Washington. So these have a more continental climate. They have hot, dry summers and cold winters. And these would be the areas of the far east, like in the Palouse. And then we have the Columbia Basin, which is a very arid, that's the shrub-steppe landscape I was talking about earlier. It's a very arid climate with the temperature extremes, even more so than the Eastern Washington lowlands. So I have come up with 6 different guilds, 3 in Western Washington and 3 in Eastern Washington. Today, I'm only going to cover 2 guilds specifically, one for Western Washington, one for Eastern Washington, because it could probably take me a couple hours to go through all 6 guilds in depth. But I will have a download available on our website that has a complete plant list for all 6 guilds. And we'll also include links to the Burke Herbarium's database with pictures that shows what areas of the state these plants are native to. And so I'm going to describe kind of the general concept of the guild, the climate it is best suited to, and then we'll go through each of the layers and some of the suggested plants. These plants that I'm suggesting are not a hard and fast rule. In many cases, there are going to be many other options that you could include in this guild, and I would encourage you to find some wild spaces near you to get some more ideas on other plants that you might like to include. The first guild for Western Washington is what I'm calling a Rainforest Edge Guild, and this is the Puget Sound lowlands and the Olympic Peninsula area, and the site is going to be partial shade with moist but well-drained soil. This could be on the coastal area. These are areas that are not going to get too hot in the summer. This would be anywhere in the Puget Sound Basin that's close to the water. And the canopy layer suggestions are the Western Red Cedar, Thuya plicata. Lived in Western Washington, you're probably very familiar with these. They're a very large, slow-growing tree. They are evergreen, and they offer a lot of wildlife shelter. The second suggestion is a bigleaf maple, Acer macrophyllum, and this is a very large deciduous shade tree. The leaves tend to turn a beautiful yellow color or in the fall, but again, it is a very large tree. For the subcanopy, the recommendations are Cascara, which is Rhamnus parishana, which is a small tree, probably 25 feet tall. I actually like this tree in the early summer, late spring, when they're in bloom. It is just alive with bees pollinating these trees. You can hear the tree buzzing. There's so many bees. And because of that, the berries that it produces are an important food for birds in the summer. The second subcanopy suggestion is vine maple, which is Acer circinatum, and it is a multi-stemmed maple tree that has fantastic fall color, and it does tolerate deep shade very well. Cascara actually can tolerate full sun. So, those are kind of different extremes, and they both, can take the partial shade or partial sun pretty well. The shrub layer, I have 4 different suggestions depending on the amount of shade. The first is a red flowering currant, Ribus sanguineum, and it's one of the earliest blooming shrubs, Western Washington, that I'm aware of. Hummingbirds love it. There are these nice, just like droops of pink and white flowers. They're very pretty. It's very sun tolerant. The next one is Pacific ninebark. It's Physocarpus capitatus, and it has this great peeling bark, this exfoliating bark that adds a lot of interest to the shrub beyond its leaves and flowers. It has great compound flowers that pollinators love, typically white. Another option is red or blue elderberry, Sambucus racemosa, or I think the other one is Sambucus nigris. Depending on where you're at, some of them, blue elderberries are a little more shade tolerant, whereas red elderberries prefer more sun. But the berries are great for the birds, and red elderberry specifically is a nitrogen fixer. So that is a great way to make sure you're keeping some of that nitrogen in your soil. And then the fourth shrub layer is Salal, with Gaultheria shallon, which is a beautiful broad-leafed evergreen. It has berries that the birds love, but it also can be very dense. Its size can vary some depending on how much sun it gets. So if it's on an edge that gets a lot of sun, it's going to stay more compact and small. And if it's deeper into the shade, it's going to get a little bit bigger and leggier as it tries to get a little bit of sun. It really likes some sun. All right, so the next layer is the herbaceous perennials, and I have 3 suggestions for this one. These are all fairly shade adapted, and so the first one is red columbine, Aguilegia formosa, and that is a favorite of hummingbirds. It's got the nice deep flower, and it self-sows readily, so you don't have to constantly buy more and re-sow every year. Another nice one is false Solomon seal, Myanthemum racemosum. It has these nice arcing stems with white flowers, and it's a fairly good-sized leaf. And then the last one is bleeding heart, Dicentra formosa, and it likes deep shade. Put it on the north edge, and it has little pink to purplish flowers, heart-shaped flowers, which is why it's called bleeding heart. And then we move on to ground covers. One great evergreen ground cover is sword fern, Polystichum minucium. It's, like I said, it's evergreen. It's got great texture. It's deer resistant, so it's great if you're in areas where deer is can be a problem. Let's see, what else? Vanilla leaf, Ashlis triphylla. I'm guessing at a lot of the pronunciations on these because most of them I've never heard pronounced. So if you think I'm butchering them, that's okay. The vanilla leaf has a really nice 3-lobed leaf, and when it dries, it actually smells like vanilla, and it has white spikes of flowers. They're very pretty, but very understated, and it spreads by rhizomes. So that one is great for sticking around and slowly spreading. Wild ginger, Asarum caudatum, is a fragrant ground cover. It's great for deep shade. And then finally, foam flower, Tiarella trifoliata, is a delicate white flower that spikes. It flowers in early spring, and again, it spreads by runners, and it's best for moist shade. So if you've got soil that's not swampy really, but that stays good and moist because it's in deep shade, that's a good option. And then this guild has a binding layer of orange honeysuckle, Lonicera ciliosa, which is a great one for hummingbirds. It has these red-orange blossoms. It'll climb a maple or a cascara or a fence. I remember seeing one, I think it's Lake Sylvia State Park, there's a honeysuckle that grows at the edge of the bridge, and it would kind of crow along the edge of the bridge. That covers all the layers of the Rainforest Edge Guild, and the primary function of this guild is to create a multi-layered woodland edge with year-round interests, and it supports diverse wildlife, and it has minimal watering needs after establishment. For some of those really deep shade plants, you're going to need a pretty dense canopy. So you're going to need a good number of sub-canopy trees or canopy trees. So those deep shade ones might be best if you have a larger space to fill. The second guild I'm going to talk about today is an Eastern Washington guild that I call the Shrub-Steppe Guild. And this guild covers areas like the Columbia Basin, the Yakima Valley, and the Wenatchee area. The ideal site has full sun, dry alkaline soil, and temperature extremes. The canopy tree for this guild is pretty typical of that area, is the Ponderosa Pine, Pinus ponderosa. This is the iconic drought-adapted pine tree of central and much of eastern Washington. And this you want scattered as a canopy tree, savanna style. Savanna style means that there is a lot of openness to the canopy. There's a lot of space between the trees to allow in plenty of sunlight. And it is not a densely planted canopy. The subcanopy for this is Western juniper, Juniperus occidentalis. It has great evergreen structure. It has berries for birds and is just an all-around versatile subcanopy layer. For the shrub layer, we have 4 different suggestions. And as I've mentioned before, you can trade any of these out for a different shrub that is better suited to your area or that you find more attractive. But I would recommend doing research to make sure you've got the best fit for the location of your garden. The first one is big sagebrush, which is Artemisia tridentata, and it is a larger aromatic shrub that provides critical wildlife habitat. The next one is antelope bitterbrush, which is Persia tridentata. It is a nitrogen fixer and is great wildlife browse. So if you have issues with large wildlife browsing, such as deer or elk or moose, I would recommend possibly finding something different. Otherwise, browse will be for smaller animals that will eat the leaves and the branches. The next one is Rabbitbrush, Erica nauseosa. It has gold flowers late in the season and is a pollinator haven. Curraleaf mountain mahogany is the 4th shrub layer suggestion, and that is Cercocarpus ledifolius. It is another nitrogen fixer, so it would be a great option instead of bitterbrush. You don't have to have 4 shrubs. These are just 4 different options. Again, is evergreen as well, the mahogany. For herbaceous perennials, we have Arrowleaf Balsamroot, which is Balsamorsia sagittata. It has a nice mounding habit with spectacular spring sunflowers, bright golden yellow. And then penstemon species, there are several, and these have the telltale tubular flowers that hummingbirds just love. So that is a great hummingbird attractor for your garden. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, is a very tough pollinator plant. It has a nice bright white compound flower, and the foliage is very lacy. It's very lacy and has little fronds of those lacy leaves, almost fern-like, but much more delicate and petite. So it adds great texture to a garden amidst all those broadleaf plants. Desert parsley, Lomatium species, offers early spring blooms and is considered an important native food. And one difference of this guild to the other one I talked about is that incorporates grasses as part of the ground cover layer. And so for the shrub step, we have blue bunch wheatgrass, which is Pseudorhogenaria spicata, which is a native bunch grass that also acts as a great soil stabilizer. Sandberg's bluegrass, Poa sedunca, is a lower growing grass. And then phlox is a low growing ground cover that has nice mats of colorful spring blossoms. This guild functions to recreate the native shrub steppe. It's incredibly drought tolerant. It supports sage dependent species. It prevents erosion and requires minimal to no irrigation. Thought I'd just give you an overview since I don't have time to go through all 6 guilds in depth. Some of the other guilds. The second Western Washington Guild is the Gary Oak Savanna, and this is kind of an adjunct to the Gary Oak Camas prairie ecosystem. The climate of this guild is for south-facing slopes in rain shadow areas, such as the San Juans or Squim, as well as most of southwestern Washington, south of Puget Sound. There's a lot of native prairie and native oak savanna traditionally in that area. And of course, the canopy is Oregon white oak, Quercus scariana. There's some of the other highlighted plants would be Pacific crabapple, serviceberry, camas, that is keystone of the oak savanna, Romer's fescue, is a primary savanna bunchgrass. Mock orange is another option. And this guild functions to recreate the authentic oak savanna ecosystem with an open canopy. So again, you want, like I said, with the pine trees, you don't want a closed canopy. You want it to be open. You want there to be significant space between each of your canopy or subcanopy trees that provide dappled shade with sunny gaps. It's extremely drought tolerant once it's established. It supports oak-dependent species, including specialist butterflies like Taylor's checker spot. It creates a mosaic of sun and shade microclimates with spectacular spring bulbs, again, the camas. It's more versatile for residential gardens than a pure prairie while maintaining ecological integrity. The Gary Oak Savanna and Oak Prairie are the Pacific Northwest's most endangered ecosystem, with less of 5% of the original area remaining. So the second Eastern Washington Guild I was going to talk about is the Palouse Prairie Guild. And this is for far eastern Washington, of course, the Palouse region and up into Spokane area. The site has full sun, deeper soils, cold winters, but more precipitation than the Columbia Basin. And again, you've got your canopy of a Ponderosa Pine with other layers, including red stem ceanothus, wild bergamot, Idaho fescue. This guild functions to recreate the rolling Palouse prairie with more moisture than the Shrub-Steppe ecosystem. It supports diverse grassland birds and pollinators and handles temperatures extremes of -20 to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and creates a classic American prairie aesthetic with seasonal drama. The last Western Washington Guild is the Mountain Meadow. And this would be the Cascade foothills and mountain valleys of 3,000 to 5,000 feet with sun to part shade and well-drained and cold hardy. This tends to have smaller trees like quaking aspen. Other plants include salmonberry, wild strawberry, fireweed, and this handles cold temperatures and the shorter growing season, provides wildlife forage, beautiful seasonal transitions, and supports pollinators during the brief mountain summer. Finally, the third Eastern Washington Guild is the Riparian Wetland Guild. And this is stream corridors, wetland edges across eastern Washington that are in full sun to part shade. They're moist to seasonally wet soil and tolerate flooding. When I think of this, I think of in central Washington, the banks of Crab Creek, which is a major irrigation waterway. And there are a lot of trees like black cottonwood and quaking aspen, willows, alders that all help to stabilize the spring banks, and shrubs like black hawthorn and Pacific ninebark, stream violet, columbine, rushes, all help to stabilize those wet areas and create lots of interest as well. The function of this guild is to stabilize stream banks and wetland edges, filters water, provides critical wildlife habitat and migration corridors. It also helps to create a cool microclimate in the hot eastern Washington areas and supports riparian-dependent species. So just real quickly, some thoughts about implementing your guild. Start with your canopy layer, get that established, and then fill in with some shrubs and perennials. Mulch heavily and water well the first year to get it well established. In year 2, you can start filling in with more herbaceous perennials. Make sure you allow some self-seeding, fill in the gaps with ground covers. Add nitrogen fixtures if it seems to be slow to start, but try not to be impatient because these are native plants and they grow at the rate that they grow. One of the benefits is that the maintenance is much lower than conventional landscapes once they're established. And all it really needs from you is regular mulching, selective weeding, and a little bit of pruning. And with that pruning, you can use the chop and drop method for nutrient cycling, which means as long as what you're pruning is not diseased, you can chop it up into smaller pieces and it just becomes part of the mulch. A few resources to mention. Again, the Burke Herbarium Image Collection is a fantastic resource when you look up the plant. It shows a map of Washington and with all the different counties that it has been found. There are some great pictures of the plants. It talks about the habitat, a general description, when it flowers, what type of pollinators are attracted to it. There's tons and tons of information about each and every one of these plants on the Burke-Barium image collection. They also have an identification key on their website as well. Washington Native Plant Society, and each region has a more specialized local society that is more in tune with the plants that are native to your specific region. Don't forget to check out local native plant nurseries. I know there are several all over the state and possibly in Idaho and Oregon that would be good resources as well. Another option is to visit regional restoration projects. I know there are several with the Oak Savanna and Oak Prairie in Southwest Washington, and I'm sure there are more throughout in the different ecosystems throughout the state. Go out into natural areas in your region for inspiration. If you like, take a book. If it's a place where your phone will work, you can key out some of the plants that you find that you're interested in, so you can identify them and then buy them from a local native plant nursery. But please do not ever dig or harvest plants in natural areas without permission, as you could be damaging delicate habitats. So just some closing takeaways. Plant guilds to work with nature, we're not against it. And native plants create resilient wildlife supporting landscapes. Washington's climate diversity offers some exciting design opportunities when you approach native plants with an intentionality, and it improves our plant biodiversity. It decreases the need for supplemental watering, and every plant guild you create becomes a small restoration project. So, with that in mind, I'd love to hear about what struck you most about the idea of a native plant guild and how you intend to implement this in your garden. You can always email me at hello@theevergreenthumb.org. Connect with us on Facebook or Instagram. We always love to hear from you. And like I mentioned before, the idea for this episode came from a listener. So if you have ideas or if there is something that you really want to hear more about, again, email me, connect with me on social media. There's a form on our website, theevergreenthumb.org, that you can submit, and it will send me an email, but we would really like to hear from you. Thanks for listening. Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Evergreen Thumb, brought to you by the WSU Extension Master Gardener Program volunteers and sponsored by the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State. We hope that today's discussion has inspired and equipped you with valuable insights to nurture your garden. The Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State is a nonprofit organization whose primary purpose is to provide unifying support and advocacy for WSU Extension Master Gardener programs throughout Washington State. To support the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State, visit www.mastergardenerfoundation.org/donate. Whether you're an experienced Master Gardener or just starting out, the WSU Extension Master Gardener program is here to support you every step of the way. WSU Extension Master Gardeners empower and sustain diverse communities with relevant, unbiased, research-based horticulture education. Reach out to your local WSU Extension office to connect with Master Gardeners and tap into a wealth of resources that can help you achieve gardening success. To learn more about the program or how to become a Master Gardener, visit mastergardener.wsu.edu/get-involved. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay connected with us, be sure to subscribe to future episodes filled with expert tips, fascinating stories, and practical advice. Don't forget to leave a review and share it with fellow gardeners to spread the joy of gardening. Questions or comments to be addressed in future episodes can be sent to hello@theevergreenthumb.org. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by guests of this podcast are their own and do not imply endorsement by Washington State University or the Master Gardener Foundation of Washington State.